This is the tutorial for the mobile VR interaction pack, and this is the demo scene. We'll come back and reference this, but for now I just want to make a new scene and create everything from the ground up. So we'll start off with the plane, and I'll make it a little bit bigger than it started off with, so we got a lot of room there. And the VR interaction pack in the demo folder has some materials, so I could drag out a material green onto the ground. And for the main camera, that should be a child, so I'm going to create a parent object, and I'm going to call it VR main. Now this is the player, so I'm going to tag it that and put the camera as the child. So we have the VR setup, but the main camera needs to be at 000, and the VR main should also, I'll start him off at 000, and if we want the camera outside of the ground, we'll raise that game object up to a 2. So there we go, we got the camera, and we want to have a we should follow the documentation so we know we do everything right. So for the initial setup, we've set up the VR main with the main camera, and the other thing we should do the main camera is add a physics raycaster. This is necessary for interaction because it's shooting a raycaster out from the camera. And the other object that we want here, if we want to move the camera in the editor, because right now there's no way to move the camera. I can't look around. If I build for VR, I can look around because I can turn my head. But in Unity, there's no way to move around if you don't have something like the Google VR SDK. So you can add the script called demo VR mouse look, and the demo VR mouse look is a script that only works in Unity Editor. It doesn't do anything in runtime, and it just lets you rotate the camera while you're holding Alt, and you can tilt it with holding Control. And again, it does absolutely nothing when you build it, because the whole entire class is inside of this custom define, or this preprocessor called if Unity Editor. So it doesn't do anything outside of Unity Editor, but that lets us move and look around. Then the next part that we got to do here is add a UI event system and the gaze input module. And then we're gonna have to move the gaze input module up above the standalone input module. So let's create the UI event system, and then we're gonna add the VR gaze input module. Now, if you're using Google VR, you would just not use the Google VR gaze input module and use this one instead. There's a Boolean here for Unity VR mode enabled, and that needs to be set if you are building for Gear VR or a virtual reality supported platform. So if this check box is selected, then you need to make sure that this checkbox is also selected on your gaze input module. However, if this is selected, the input system will not work correctly in the editor. So while you're testing, you want to have this disabled, and then when you're getting ready to build, if you're building for a native VR platform like Gear VR, you need to make sure this is checked when you build. And like I said, this is a early access to the pack, so it's at a discounted price, and we're working on automating this so it's a lot easier, and it just does it automatically. So now that we've added the VR gaze input module, and it's moved up above there, we are ready to start testing. The next, we'll want to get a dot on the screen though. So now that we've done all this, let's go ahead and move on to interacting with objects. Now to interact with objects, we'll need to add the one of the dots here. So you can either pick the VR dot or the VR ring, and that's in the prefabs folder. I'll just pick the VR dot. Now if you want, you could put both on the main camera and then turn one of them off. So for now I shouldn't see anything because that dot only appears when you're looking at an interactive object. So I'm going to create a cube, and the cube, just like with the ground, I'm going to go ahead and just give it a material, one of the ones from the demo folder, like this brown. And even though it has a box collider, I can't interact with it unless it has the VR interactive object script on it. So now that the script's been added and interaction is enabled, when I look at that box, the dot will appear. And here is a couple of options we can work with. Interaction distance is how close I am to the object. So if I were to put this down to 1, you'll notice that the dot won't appear because I'm not close enough to interact with it. So we'll move that back to 5 so that we're allowed to interact with it. And there's a click with gaze, and that actually performs a click, and that is the pointer down, pointer up, or pointer click event in the event system when you look at the object for 3 seconds. So it'll actually click on this after 3 seconds if this option is enabled, and then the other option is to show an outline. So now that I've clicked show an outline, you'll see that the outline appears, and there's options for the outline width and the outline color and the grow speed, so how long it takes to grow to its full width. So with the 0.1 it's going to go really slow, and it's a little bit easier to see what I'm talking about, I suppose, if I make a brighter color and get a little bit closer to the cube. So let me just move that cube. Here we go. And you'll see when I look at it, the outline grows over time. It slowly grows to its full width that you've set. So this is just how fast it shrinks and grows. And then there's the depth offset. The depth offset is how far or how near or far away from the camera the outline is drawn. So a 0 is kind of a good value to start with, but if you want it to draw, let's say that is further away, so you can see it cuts off right here. And if I were to do a negative 0.1, that's actually going to draw closer, so you'll see that the depth that it's drawing over the object down here. So a positive number is where it's actually going to be an outline, where it's not over drawing the object here. So it's a depth offset of 0, but this is good for objects like doors or complicated objects where the outline is not appearing as you want it to. You can adjust the depth offset to move that closer or further away to get the desired outline effect that you want. So that's how the VR interactive object works. Now here I could do events for the pointer enter, pointer exit, pointer down, and pointer up. So if I were to do a pointer on pointer enter, and we could add the mesh render, and say for the mesh render material, we could set that to a material like green. Well, green's the ground, so let's go blue. And if I look at that now, it should turn blue. Okay. And then next time I look at it, I want it to go brown, so I'm going to change it back. And then for a pointer down, now it's good to do clicks on pointer down because a click consists of pointer down, pointer up, and then a click is that's considered a click. So if you just push down, so for example on the cardboard headset here, if you just click down, it only registers the pointer down. It doesn't register the down up. So it's best, I've found, to just use the pointer down event for your click events. So on pointer down, you could, you could add a script here and do whatever you want, of course, but just for an example, again, I'll just drag the object in here, and that's just the same thing as dragging this into here. And I could say game object set active, and this is true and that's false. So set active false. So because I have the click time set to 3 and click with gaze is set, if I look at the box for 3 seconds, it should turn off that game object. So that's how you use the VR interactive object. And the UI, to get the UI set up as it is in the demo scene, we added a UI, and we added we'll just add a new canvas. And then that creates a huge canvas that matches the screen space. We want to change that to world space. And then we'll move the position to 0, 0, 0. And we'll start with a width and a height of 100 by 100. And that's pretty big. Takes up, well, it's the same size as the whole ground here. So you could scale that down, 0.01, 0.01, 0.01. And then you end up with something that's like the size of a TV screen. Now, if it's a wide screen, it's going to be, wider than it is high. But we have the world space canvas. Now we can add UI, for example, a panel. And now if I were to play the game, we'll see that that UI in world space, and we want to interact with it. So on the panel, we're just going to add a UI button. And then on the button, again, we don't want to use the on click because that is a pointer down and a pointer up. So I'm going to add a event trigger, and in the event trigger, I'm going to add a pointer down event, and this is where I'll put my click action for the button. Now, when you add a button, it's really important to pay attention to everything that's going on in your UI, because a lot of these components are going to get the raycast target option, which is telling it whether or not the gaze is gonna, and by the gaze I mean this physics raycaster, whether or not this physics raycaster is going to hit this UI element. So if it's not something we want to hit, we should deselect raycast target. Now I want to hit the button, so I want to raycast target on the image here, and the button's interactable, but the text doesn't need to be a raycast target. Now there's the option here, so I'm going to deselect raycast target. That way when my ray shoots from the camera and it's coming this way and it hits the text, it just completely ignores it because this is not a raycast target. And then that raycast will just hit this, which is the button, and that's what we want to interact with. Now, right now, I can't interact with that button at all because it needs to have the VR interactive UI script on it. And this is very similar to the VR interactive object script. It has the distance option, so how close you need to be to interact with it, and then whether or not you click on that button with the gaze, and what the click gaze time is, or how many seconds you have to look at the button before the click occurs. So right now, let me just go ahead and do as I did before. I'm going to add the game out object of the, well, let me duplicate the button, and that way we got the two buttons here, and we'll just turn off each other when we click on the button. So when you click on this first button, and we'll call it button A, this is exactly how I built the demo scene. We got the button A and the button B. So when you click on button A, for button A's game object, it's going to turn it off, and for button B's game object, it's going to turn it on, And when you click on button B, 2 actions. We want button A, we'll start with button B and then add button A. So if you click on button B, it's going to turn itself off and it's going to turn the other button on. So now if I hit play, I get the dot, as you can see, on the screen, and that's because it has the VR interactive UI script, and I'm within distance. And again, if I bring this down to 1, I can't interact with the bottom button, but I can with the top. So I'll move that back up to 5, and if I click on it, it goes away, and they turn each other on and off. Now if I click with gaze, it's going to perform that action after 3 seconds, like it says here. Except, now that click with gaze was not working because I was trying to set the value here at runtime, and that doesn't work because in the mono behavior start function, it sets some values here if the click with gaze option is set. So I need to make sure I enable this before I press play. That way I can click on the buttons with the gaze. So now that I've set that, if I look at the button, it'll click on it after 3 seconds, just as if I was actually clicking the button. But that lets you do mobile VR interaction without having the physical button on the headset. So that's how to set up an object and a UI and the basic setup. From here, we could import the Google VR SDK and build for Google VR Cardboard, or we could go into the build options and then set virtual reality supported, which is going to set Oculus. And because Android is our build target, that's going to build for Gear VR. Now, if I go back into the demo scene, we can look at, essentially, that's how everything in this scene is set up. And I'm not going to take the time in this video to go over how every single demo is working here, because that's kind of outside of the scope. For example, animation. This door has a animator on it, and it just has one animation that plays an open effect. So you could go to the window animator, and you could see how that door open is working. But this is a simple example for you to go take a look at and see how it's working. Let me know if you have questions. And this Android guide just has the VR interactive object with an outline setup. These boxes have they don't have the VR interactive object script on them, but they do have an event trigger and a box collider, which means the pointer will respond to them. It just can't use the distance feature, so it'll infinitely respond to these objects. But I put a script on them called demo move rigid body, so that when you look at these objects, it moves them. And this is also an example of how you can have interactive objects without using the VR interactive object script. The door uses the VR interactive object script to work with the animator, and the demo play animation script plays that animation. And all these demo scripts are real simple, so that you could easily see what's going on. Now this Unity logo shows the outline, and this other Unity logo doesn't. However, they both have the VR interactive object script. You'll see here I got it, and here I got it. And when I look at them, this one gets a outline, and this one doesn't. And actually, if you look behind it, there it is. You'll see that it's all green on the back, and that's the outline. You'll notice, because if I look away, that goes away. So if I look back, you'll see the green comes back. This is the outline. So this is an example of where the outline shader is not going to work. The way the outline shader works, it needs to have some edges like this, a little bit of depth to it, and so it can't be just a flat plane like this Unity logo is, because the outline shader is not able to work correctly. So as you'll see here on this object, we just selected these faces essentially and extruded them back so that the object had a little bit of depth, and in that case the outline shader, it can work fine. Now I also want to mention that on objects that have the outline, they cannot be static. At least they can't be batching static. So you can set, you just can't be fully static like this. So either uncheck the check mark here, so it's not static at all. But if you want it to be light map static, so it gets a light map or occluder static, that's fine. Just uncheck batching static. Because the mesh cannot be batched. The outline needs the mesh in order to create the unique outline. So when you have batching enabled, it batches all of the meshes into one mesh when it runs. So it can't create the outline because this object, for example, becomes a part of the rest of the static object's mesh. And then we can't draw the outline. And the way the outline works, just to show, is, for example, when I look at the Unity logo here, if I get close enough, you'll see that it's became apparent. I'll look away. So you see the arrow right here, and I look away, and the arrow goes away. So this is not a parent object, but when I look at it and the outline, it becomes one because the outline is a separate object. It's a child object, and it's a mesh renderer that uses the same mesh as the original object, and it has a material on it with a shader that is the outline only shader, and the outline only shader of course only draws the outline. So if I were to turn off the mesh renderer of the original object, you would still see the child with the outline only shader being drawn. So make sure that any objects that use an outline are not batching static. All these objects are just examples of, for one, how to show text over an object when you look at it. And just different colors essentially on the shader. And this object shows you how to set up a parent-child relationship, because of the way colliders work in Unity, and that's what's detecting the raycast. The parent-child relationship between colliders is pretty tricky. So what we do here is, on the child, when the pointer enters the child object, it disables interaction on the parent object. So to explain a little bit better what exactly is happening, you'll see this interactive object with children is the blue box, and on the VR interactive object script, interaction is enabled, and that means I'm allowed to look at it and interact with it. Now if I turn that off, I can't interact with it at all. So what happens is, when you look at the child, it fires this event which turns off the VR interactive object interaction enabled boolean on the parent. So if I'm looking at the child, you'll notice that this gets turned off. And that's how you have to set up a parent-child relationship if you need to have children objects that are interactive. And then over here again, I can't go into full detail of how everything's working. I guess that's what the demo's for, so you can take a look and see how it's all working. But here's the gaze slider. So this is a Unity UI slider to respond to the gaze. And if there's a script on that one to take a look at, so you'll see that slider has the VR gaze slider script. So take a look at this script to see how that's working. Same thing with the radio button. Nice little example for a radio button here that uses the alpha cutoff shader. And if you want to see how that's working, take a look at the radio cutout button scripts. And I also have a tutorial on my channel here for how to make this radio button from scratch. And these examples are pretty self-explanatory. You can go look through the UI to see how it's set up. But as I already discussed, it was a little bit tricky to get all these UIs set up because you have to pay attention to each UI element down here and whether it has the raycast target option set on it. But to help some of that out, it doesn't respond to UI elements at all if it doesn't have the VR interactive UI script on it. And so, as you see, for example, on the slider here, VR interactive UI, if it doesn't have that, it's not going to respond to it anyways. However, it is good to turn off the raycast target on any UI elements that don't need it, like the text that's on a button. Alright, I hope this tutorial helps you out to get it set up and going. Let me know down in the comments what you need help with, and we'll get it going. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next video.